Pastor Matt.
And I'm Mary Rose.
And we're glad that you're joining us again on our Lenten journey through Luke's Gospel. Today, we're picking it up at chapter 7.
When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the man. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well.
So here in this story, we see a Gentile who has at least heard of Jesus and is now asking for something. And he has the Jews who are of the town go and ask Jesus. In part, it sounds like because he's done them a favor. So he's asking them to kind of do him a favor by going and getting Jesus to come and heal his servant. But there's a couple of amazing things that happen in this story. Notice, this is the first time Jesus is amazed by anything. We should probably take note of that. And he's amazed by this man's faith. Because the centurion never even comes to see Jesus. So as the centurion sends, or the delegation, or sends the people, and his servants follow up later, what does he think Jesus needs to do? What is it all he's asking of Jesus?
Just to speak, and he'll be healed.
Which is remarkable and incredible. And Jesus is amazed by that, right? Everyone else wants him to touch them or wants him to come near. But this centurion hears of Jesus and says, if you just say the word, I understand how authority works. If you just say it, it will be accomplished. And there's a parallel story to this that we should be thinking of. And it's in 2 Kings chapter 5. And it's Naaman and Elisha, right? The Syrian commander who has leprosy and comes to ask to be healed. Elisha never sees him. He has to trust in Elisha's word. And I think we should think about this because Luke has already brought up this story earlier when Jesus was in the temple and he opened the scroll. He said, remember that there were many lepers in Israel, but God only had him heal Naaman, a Gentile, and it caused offense. So this story should already be in our mind as we're hearing this gospel story. There's something that I only noticed reading it this time that hadn't struck me before. How does the last verse read, Mary Rose?
Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well.
Does Jesus ever even say a word about healing in this?
He just says he's not found such great faith even in Israel.
He never says that he's going to heal them. He's never said, go back, it's already happened. He never says a word about healing, which is ironic in a story about the authority of the word. I don't know what to do with that, but I find it really fascinating.
In the story where the man's faith says you only need to say the word, Jesus is kind of like, actually, I don't even have to say the word.
His authority is that great and astounding. I mean, he does acknowledge the man's faith and trust in his authority, but he doesn't say the word here, which is just remarkable. And I never noticed that before preparing for this, that I had never noticed that Jesus doesn't actually say a word about healing the man, which is kind of incredible. But we'll continue on, picking it up at verse 11. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, Do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. Can you look at yours, Mary Rose? Does it say in verse 12, a man or a young man had died?
In verse 12, it just says the only son of his mother.
Okay. In most of their translation, it doesn't say a man. And so the assumption is that this person who died is somewhere around 13, 14, so still young. Where a man, kind of, at least in our contemporary language, sounds much older than that. In this story, there's a couple of things that I think are really worth highlighting. Part of this is really about showing the compassion Jesus has. Because it starts by saying, as he came into town, into Nain, which again should trigger our minds back to 1 Kings 17, where there's a story of a widow whose son is raised from the dead by Elijah. But it says that Jesus saw her and was moved with compassion. And Greek note, this has one of the variations of one of my favorite Greek words, Mary Rose. You might remember, it might be familiar to you, is esplankniste, from the root splanknizomai, which I just love to say because it's fun and it sounds entertaining, which splanknizomai means that he felt the compassion in his bowels, in his gut. As he saw her sorrow, it moved him. He had pity in the depth of his stomach. And so this story is a lot less about the healing and resurrection and more about the character of Jesus' mission and his redemptive intervention. That God is acting with compassion for someone who has lost everything. He sees her and is moved. He sees her, and why would he be so moved with compassion for her? Well, what does it note about the woman? She's a widow, and what has she just lost?
Her son.
Her only son. And so, not only is she a widow, now she has no one who can function as the head of the household, who can provide for her. She's about as low as you can get now in the totem pole. All of her means of survival have been taken away. And so Jesus sees this woman. It doesn't say that she appealed to him. He walked in and he knows. And he sees in this town and he has compassion on her. It's a reminder that God sees even when we don't cry out to him. He sees and is moved with compassion, wanting to reach out to us. And like I talked about, this story is paralleled in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8 to 24, where Elijah, the great prophet, gives the son who had passed away back to the widow at Nain. That's in verse 23 of that passage. And so we notice that Jesus, it says, when the young man rises, returns him to the woman. If you have been raised from the dead and Jesus is standing there in front of you, what do you think you'd probably most likely do with Jesus? Follow him, I would guess. Maybe become a disciple. If he's raised you from the dead, that's what happens with Lazarus, right? He's raised from the dead and they continue to follow him closely. But Jesus seems to give this young man back to his mother. And it seems like what Jesus says is important enough is taking care of those earthly responsibilities and following him as a disciple where he is. He doesn't necessarily have to leave his mom behind and forsake her and leave her with no means of hope or any care.
I'm just not sure where you're getting that, because it doesn't talk about, he doesn't say, don't come follow me. I don't understand.
But it does say...
It says Jesus gave him back to his mother.
Yes. And so I would take that to mean, like, gave him back as handing back that responsibility to be the leader of that household and not forsake all of that. Because that's compassion, is she's lost everything, even the care and the one who's supposed to provide for her. And so now Jesus raised him from the dead and is giving that back to her, which is the full restoration for her.
I guess I only ever read that as, like, he gave him back to her because he was now alive.
And I think that's part of it, but I think it's also putting him back in her household. It's restoring to that former vocation that he should have had and is called to fulfill. It kind of goes hand in hand with Jesus in other places where he's talking about those from the temple and synagogue would say, well, if you've designated or given this to God, and it's korban I think it's in Mark's gospel, but that if you've given it to God, then you don't have to care for your father and mother anymore. You're not breaking the commandment. And Jesus would say that you're actually breaking this commandment in your false piety that's pretending to honor God. You're actually dishonoring task and the role and responsibility he's given you. So continuing on from there.
In verse 18, John's disciples told him about all these things. Calling 2 of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" When the men came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to you to ask, 'Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?'" At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleaned, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me."
So in this story, we have John the Baptist, a forerunner who recognizes Jesus, is struggling with some questions. Why do you think he's struggling, Mary Rose?
Well, John, like most of the Jews, I think was still looking for an earthly type king that was going to come in and change everything. And so even though, word of Jesus is getting back and the miraculous things he's doing, I think Jesus still is not acting exactly how everyone thought he was going to act.
Yeah. And where is John, that he's sending his disciples from? Where is he already at this point that we learned earlier in, I think, chapter 3?
He's in prison.
He's in prison, right? And if we remember John's message to those who are wicked and evil and not repenting, Luke chapter 3, is that the axe is already at the root of the trees. You brood of vipers. Judgment is coming. And what has Jesus' ministry been filled with so far?
Mercy, not judgment.
So, understandably, John's looking at me going, did I get the wrong memo? This is not what I thought was going to come about from this mission. Right? So, just thinking back to the previous story we just read, Jesus showing mercy to a widow in Nain and to a Gentile centurion's servant. And he's been forgiving sins left and right. And so John's a little confused. And he's confused because, like you said, he's expecting an earthly Messiah, but John is languishing in prison. He's sitting there wondering, well, I've preached what I was called to preach, and yet I'm not where I thought I'd be right now. And some people have tried to make this story as though John isn't really questioning. He's just sending it for the sake of his disciples. I think that's a load of hogwash. I think John is literally a little confused because it is not meeting his expectations. And that's where I think the last part of the last verse you read is really important. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. So Jesus is sending back, report all these things to John. And I'm not upset at him for doubting and being a little confused. But blessed is he who's not offended because I'm showing mercy. And we've seen already, and is going to continue to mount, who is it that keeps getting offended that Jesus is showing mercy?
The religious leaders.
Yeah, it is the religious leaders and the self-righteous that keep on getting offended at Jesus showing mercy. John's a little baffled, but I don't think he's offended by it, because Jesus is still calling out some of the hypocrisy, but he's also showing mercy to others. And all of these things that he tells the disciples, John's disciples, to report back to him are from Isaiah 35, 1-7. That's kind of where Jesus is paraphrasing or quoting from. And he's saying all of these things that were promised about the coming Messiah have been happening. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The dead are raised. Good news is proclaimed to the poor. I am the fulfillment of what you were looking for. And Jesus does something interesting. He leaves out part of Isaiah 35 verse 4, where it says the vengeance of God coming to save you. He leaves that line out. And I think part of it is because has Jesus come in his earthly ministry to bring vengeance?
No.
What is he coming to bring in his earthly ministry?
Forgiveness of sins.
Compassion, love. The only vengeance that happens in his earthly ministry is what he bears upon himself on the cross. So he doesn't say it here. Is Jesus going to come back in vengeance upon the enemies of God and to save his people?
Yeah, his second coming.
His second coming, right? So when he comes again, that all those who oppress God's people, there will be judgment on them and there will be the wrongs made right. And so that other half of the message that John the Baptist had been preaching will be fulfilled. Just not in the way he expected, in the timing he expected. And so I think the parting thought, I think that I have again, the reminder is just trusting in the authority of God's word to accomplish what he desires even from a distance. And, we can always take that back to the sacraments, right? What does it deliver? Well, it delivers the forgiveness of sin and life because it has the authority of God's word connected to it. And so we should never doubt those promises given to us.